Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Before we get on with the show, I'd like to take a couple of minutes of your time and ask for some support. The show is brought to you, as always, by the supporters on Patreon. I'm hearing from a lot of people how valuable they find the show, and those supporters who have the means to help fund it, to keep me going, and to help me carry on reaching new audiences are very much appreciated. I've also mentioned a couple of times in the last few weeks that I work in the hospitality industry that's been hit very hard by the pandemic. And I've been on short time at work and stressing a bit about money. So other than helping me keep the show going, contributions at the moment have helped keep me personally going and helped me to make ends meet. So I'm grateful to the people that have helped those, and I would really be grateful if anyone could continue to help. Because I really would love to take this full time and get out of the industry that I've been in for a long time and I'm honestly kind of tired of. I'd love to be able to continue to just help people sleep as a full-time part of my life. So if you're making use of Sleepy Time Tales regularly to help you deal with sleeplessness, and you have the urge to support the show, and most importantly, if you have the means, please check out patreon.com/sleepytimetales, or go to the link in the show notes or from the website and take a look at what's available. You will have the satisfaction of knowing that you're contributing to the rest and lifestyle improvement of thousands of people. And over and above that, there are real rewards available from as little as $2 a month. There's early release of the weekly episodes, weekly bonus episodes, and special edits of the main show. Someone who signed up last week was Angela, who joined the Patreon. Thank you very much, Angela, for signing up. Thank you for your help, and welcome to the Sleepy Time Tales family. I also recently signed up for a new service called Buy Me a Coffee. So if you would like to help support the show but not have to sign up for a whole new service, you can make up once-off contributions there without having to sign up for anything. That's buymeacoffee.com/sleepytimetales. And there's a button on the website and a link in the show notes to that as well. But while I've been speaking about money, there are other ways you can support the show. I mean, money's handy to buy things, but at the end of the day, one of the best things you really can do is simply to spread the word. If there's someone you know who you think would appreciate from Sleepy Time Tales, some other person you work with or who's in your life who complains about not being able to sleep, just let them know. Spread the word. If everybody who finds it useful spreads this to somebody who they think will find it useful, Sleepy Time Tales will just go from strength to strength. And honestly, I don't do much in the way of promotion, and every month the Sleepy Time Tales really does go from strength to strength. So there's a lot of you out there who really are spreading the word and helping the show to grow. Also, if you do recommend the show on social media, please make sure to tag me so that I can see and I can thank you. That's at Sleepy Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter. Last but not least, of course, I need to shout out the music, which is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. Their music is available on their website at loyaltyfreakmusic.com. And I've linked the website in the show notes, as they've got some very cool stuff that they release under various names, and I do recommend you check them out. Thanks for taking the time. Let's get back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for, this strange idea, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to? But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, with your mind spinning and your emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Sleepy Time Tales is intended to be used as a distraction to what keeps you awake at night, or sometimes background noise, or maybe simply company. That's why I make these episodes quite long. It's not so that you listen through to the whole thing, but it's so that I'm here for you without any pressure of the end coming. As far as I know, there's a couple of different ways to engage with the show. For me, I need something to focus on, a story or an event that keep my mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxieties, to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep when it comes for me. And I think that's how the majority of listeners do engage with Sleepy Time Tales, but there is another way as well. The second way is some people just need background, some kind of white noise, sound of the wind, sound of the rain, sound of the ocean, or maybe just some boring dude droning on in the background. But however you choose to engage with the show, however it works for you, the main thing is you can't force sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the thread of the story and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, I'm hoping you're asleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it's important you don't feel pressurized. If this is your first night, this probably won't work for you. I'd recommend giving it a solid 3 nights try to see if maybe you need to get used to it. Because it is a bit of a strange idea after all. You might need to get used to listening to my voice. You may need to take some time to learn that you can trust me. And maybe one episode isn't long enough because maybe your problem is a little bit different. If you're someone who wakes up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep, what I find helpful is with the stuff that I listen to, is I download a whole bunch of episodes, I put them in a playlist, and then I start with the latest one and I let them run all night. That way, when I wake up at 3 a.m., if my earbuds have fallen out, I pop them back in and I waft straight back to sleep again. I even do the same thing sometimes when I wake up a little bit before my alarm, sometimes 30 minutes or 60 minutes, and I do exactly the same thing. Pop my earbuds back in, go back to sleep again, and you may wonder, Dave, what's the point in an extra 30 minutes of sleep? But I got to tell you, and I've had people get in touch with me to thank me for the suggestion, that sometimes that 30 minutes can be the best part of your night. But it's very important, whether you're trying to get to sleep or trying to go back to sleep or just trying to get a last little 40 winks in before the sun rises, that you just try to relax into this. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this will probably seem strange to you. So just give it a chance. Because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. This week we return to Lena Rivers by Mary Jane Holmes. John made Miss Nancy no answer, but turning to his mother he said, "I'm in earnest, mother, about your carrying so many useless things. We don't want them. Our house is full now. And besides that, Mrs. Livingston is very particular about the style of her furniture, and I'm afraid yours would hardly come up to her ideas of elegance." "That chest of drawers," said Mrs. Nichols, pointing at an old-fashioned high-top bureau, "cost an ocean of money when 'twas new. And if the brasses on it was rubbed up, Tilda couldn't tell 'em from gold, unless she's seen more on it than I have, which ain't much likely, being I double her age." "The chest does very well for you, I admit," said John, "but we have neither use nor room for it. So if you can't sell it, why give it away or burn it, one or the other." Mrs. Nichols saw he was decided, and forthwith Lena was dispatched to Widow Fisher's to see if she would take it at half price. The widow had no fancy for second-hand articles. Consequently, Miss Nancy was told to keep it, and maybe she'd sometimes have a chance to send it to Kentucky. It won't come amiss, I know, supposing they be well on. I believe I'm looking out for a rainy day. I can teach Tilda economy yet, whispered Mrs. Nichols, glancing towards the room where John sat, whistling, whittling, and pondering in his own mind the best way of reconciling his wife to what could not well be helped. Lena, who was naturally quick-witted, had partially divined the cause of her uncle's moodiness. The more she saw of him, the better she liked him, and she began to think that she would willingly try to cure herself of the peculiarities which evidently annoyed him, if he would only notice her a little, which he was not likely to do. He seldom noticed any child, much less little Lena, who he fancied was ignorant as well as awkward, but he did not know her. One day when, as usual, he sat whittling and thinking, Lena approached him softly and, laying her hand upon his knee, said rather timidly, "Uncle, I wish you'd tell me something about my cousins." "What about them?" he asked, somewhat gruffly, for it grated upon his feelings to hear his daughters called cousin by her. "I want to know how they look, and which one I shall like the best," continued Lena. "You'll like Anna the best," said her uncle, and Lena asked why. "What sort of girl is she? Does she love to go to school and study?" "None too well, I reckon," returned her uncle, adding that there were not many little girls who did. "Why, I do," said Lena, and her uncle, stopping for a moment his whittling, replied rather scornfully, "You? I should like to know what you ever studied besides the spelling book." Lena reddened, for she knew that, whether deservedly or not, she bore the reputation of being an excellent scholar for one of her age, and now she rather tartly answered, "I studied geography, arithmetic, grammar, and—" history she was going to add, but her uncle stopped her, saying, That'll do, that'll do. You study all these? Now I don't suppose you know which one of them is." "Yes, I do," said Lena, with a good deal of spirit. "Olney's geography is a description of the earth. Colburn's arithmetic is a science of numbers. Smith's grammar teaches us how to speak correctly." "Why don't you do it then?" asked her uncle. "Do what?" said Lena, and her uncle continued. "Why don't you make use of your boasted knowledge of grammar? Why, my Anna has never seen the inside of a grammar that I know of, but she doesn't talk like you do." "Don't what, sir?" said Lena. "Don't talk like you do," repeated her uncle, while Lena's eyes fairly danced with mischief as she asked if that were good grammar. Mr. Livingston coloured, thinking it just possible that he himself might sometimes be guilty of the same things for which she so harshly chided Lena, of whom from this time he began to think more favourably. It could hardly be said that he treated her with any more attention, and there was still a difference which he felt, and which made her very happy. Chapter 4. On the Road. At last the packing-up process came to an end. Everything too poor to sell and too good to give away had found a place. Some here, some there, and some in John's trunk, among his ruffled bosoms, collars, dickies, and so forth. Miss Nancy, who stood by till the last, was made the receiver of sundry cracked teacups, noseless pitchers, and iron spoons, which could not be disposed of elsewhere. Now every box and trunk was ready. Farmer Truesdale's red wagon stood at the door, waiting to convey them to the depot, and nothing remained for Grandma Nichols but to bid adieu to the old spot, endeared to her by so many associations. Again and again she went from room to room, weeping always and lingering longest in the one where her children were born, and where her daughter and husband had died. In the corner stood the old low-post bedstead, the first she had ever owned, and now how vividly she recalled the time long years before when she, a happy maiden, ordered that bedstead, blushing deeply at the sly allusion which the cabinet-maker made to her approaching marriage. He, too, was with her, strong and healthy. Now he was gone from her side forever. His couch was a narrow coffin, and the old bedstead stood there, naked, empty. Seating herself upon it, the old lady rocked to and fro, moaning in her grief and wishing that she were not going to Kentucky, whether it were possible now to remain at her mountain home. Summoning all her courage, she gave one glance at the familiar objects around her, at the flowers she had planted, and then taking Lena's hand, went down to the gate where her son waited. He saw she had been weeping, and though he could not appreciate the cause of her tears, in his heart he pitied her, and his voice and manner were unusually kind as he helped her to get the best seat in the wagon and asked if she were comfortable. Then his eyes fell upon her dress, and his pity changed to anger as he wondered if she was wholly devoid of taste. At the time of his father's death, he purchased decent mourning for both his mother and Lena. But these, Mrs. Nichols pronounced, altogether good for the nasty cars. Nobody'd think any better of them for being rigged out in their best meeting gowns. So the bombazine was packed away, and in its place she wore dark blue and white spotted calico, which John could have sworn she had 20 years before, and which was not unlikely, as she never wore out a garment. She was an enemy to long skirts, hence hers came just to her ankles, and as her black stockings had been footed with white, there was visible a dark rim. Altogether she presented a rather grotesque appearance, with her oblong work bag, in which were her snuff box, brass spectacles, and half a dozen nutcakes, which would save John's buying dinner. Unlike her grandmother's, Lena's dress was a deal too long, and as she never wore pantalettes, she had the look of a premature old woman instead of a child 7 summers old as she was. Still, the uncommon beauty of her face and the natural gracefulness of her form intoned in a measure for the singularity of her appearance. In the doorway stood Miss Nancy, and by her side her nephew Joel Slocum, a freckle-faced boy who had frequently shown a preference for Lena by going with her for her grandmother's cow, bringing her harvest apples, and letting her ride on his sled oftener than the other girls at school. Strange to say, his affection was not returned, and now, notwithstanding, he several times wiped both eyes and nose, on the end of which was an enormous freck. Lena did not relent at all, but with a simple "Goodbye, Joe," she sprang into the wagon, which moved rapidly away. It was about 5 miles from the farmhouse to the depot, and when half that distance had been gone over, Mrs. Nichols suddenly seized the reins, ordering the driver to stop and saying she must go straight back, for on the shelf of the north room cupboard she had left a whole paper of tea which she couldn't afford to lose. "Drive on," said Johnny rather angrily, at the same time telling his mother that he could buy her a ton of tea if she wanted it. "But that was already bought, and 'twould save so much," said she, softly wiping away a tear, which was occasioned partly by her son's manner, and partly by the great loss she felt she sustained in leaving behind her favourite old hyson. This saving was a matter of which Grandma Nichols said so much, that John, who was himself slightly avaricious, began to regret that he ever knew the definition of the word save. Lest our readers get a wrong impression of Mrs. Nichols, we must say she possessed very many sterling qualities, and her habits of extreme economy resulted more from the manner in which she had been compelled to live than from natural stinginess. For this, John hardly made allowance enough, and his mother's remarks, instead of restraining him, only made him more lavish of his money than he would otherwise have been. When Mrs. Nichols and Lena entered the cars, they of course attracted universal attention, which annoyed John excessively. In Oakland, where his mother was known and appreciated, he could bear it, but among strangers and with those of his own caste, it was different. So motioning them into the first unoccupied seat, he sauntered on with an air which seemed to say they were nothing to him, and finding a vacant seat at the other end of the car, he took possession of it. Scarcely, however, had he entered into conversation with a gentleman near him, when someone grasped his arm, and looking up he saw his mother, her box in one hand, an enormous pinch of snuff in another. "John," said she, elevating her voice so as to drown out the noise of the cars, "I never thought on it till this minute, but I'd just as lief ride in the second-class cars as not, and it only costs half as much." Mr. Livingston coloured crimson and bade her go back, saying that if he paid the fare, she needn't feel troubled about the cost. Just as she was turning to leave, the loud ring and whistle as the train neared a crossing startled her, and in great alarm she asked if something hadn't bust. John made no answer, but the gentleman near him very politely explained to her the cause of the disturbance, after which she returned to her seat. When the conductor appeared, he fortunately came in at the door nearest John, who pointed out the two for whom he had tickets, and then turned again to converse with the gentleman, who, though a stranger, was from Louisville, Kentucky, and whose acquaintance was easily made. The sight of the conductor awoke in Mrs. Nichols' brain a new idea, and after peering out upon the platform, she went rushing up to her son, telling him that the trunks, box, featherbed, and all were every one of them left. "No, they are not," said John. "I saw them aboard myself." "Well, then, they're lost off, for as soon as you're born, there ain't one on 'em in here, and there's as much as 20 weight of new feathers besides all the crockery. Holler to 'em to stop quick." The stranger, pitying Mr. Livingston's chagrin, kindly explained to her that there was a baggage car on purpose for trunks and the like, and that her featherbed was undoubtedly safe. This quietened her, and mentally styling him a proper nice man, she again returned to her seat. "A rare specimen of the raw Yankee," said the stranger to John, never dreaming in what relation she stood to him. "Yes," answered John, not thinking it all necessary to make any further explanations. By this time, Mrs. Nichols had attracted the attention of all the passengers, who had watched her movements with great interest. Among these was a fine-looking youth, 15 or 16 years of age, who sat directly in front of Lena. He had a remarkably open, pleasing countenance, while there was that in his eyes which showed him to be a lover of fun. Thinking he had now found it in a rich form, he turned partly around, and would undoubtedly have quizzed Mrs. Nichols unmercifully, had it not been something in the appearance of Lena prevented him. This was also her first ride in the cars, but she possessed a tact of concealing the fact, and if she sometimes felt frightened, she looked in the faces of those around her, gathering from them there was no danger. She knew that her grandmother was making herself ridiculous, and her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "Do sit still, Granny. Everyone is looking at you." The young lad noticed this, and while it quelled in him the spirit of ridicule, it awoke a strange interest in Lena, who he saw was beautiful, spite of her unseemly guise. She was a dear lover of nature, and as the car sped on through the wild mountain scenery between Pittsfield and Albany, she stood at the open window, her hands closely locked together, her lips slightly parted, and her eyes wide with wonder at the country through which they were passing. At her grandmother's suggestion, she had removed her bonnet, and the brown curls which clustered around her white forehead and neck were moved up and down by the fresh breeze which was blowing. The youth was a passionate admirer of beauty, come in what garb it might, and now as he watched he felt a strong desire to touch one of the glossy ringlets which floated within his reach. There would be no harm in it, he thought. She was only a little girl, and he was almost a man, had tried to shave, and was going to enter college in the fall. Still, he felt some doubts as to the propriety of the act, and was about making up his mind that he had better not, when the train shot into the tunnel, and for an instant they were in total darkness. Quick as thought, his hand sought the brown curls, but they were gone, and when the cars again emerged into daylight, Lena's arms were around her grandmother's neck, trying to hold her down, for the old lady, sure of a smash-up this time, had attempted to rise, screaming loudly for John. The boy laughed aloud. He could not help it. But when Lena's eyes turned reprovingly upon him, he felt sorry and anxious to make amends, addressed himself very politely to Mrs. Nichols, explaining to her that it was a tunnel through which they had passed, and assuring her there was no danger whatever. Then turning to Lena, he said, "I reckon your grandmother is not much accustomed to traveling." "No, sir," answered Lena, the rich blood dyeing her cheek at being addressed by a stranger. It was the first time anyone had ever said sir to the boy. And now, feeling quite like patronizing the little girl, he continued, I believe old people generally are timid when they enter the cars for the first time. Nothing from Lena except a slight straightening up of her body and a smoothing down of her dress. But the ice was broken, and ere long she and her companion were conversing as familiarly as if they had known each other for years. Still, the boy was not inquisitive. He did not ask her name or where she was going, though he told her that his home was in Louisville, and that at Albany he was to take the boat for New York, where his mother was stopping with some friends. He also told her that the gentleman near the door, with dark eyes and whiskers, was his father. Glancing towards the person indicated, Lena saw that it was the same gentleman who all afternoon had been talking with her uncle. He was noble-looking, and she felt glad that he was the father of the boy. He was just such a man, she fancied, as ought to be his father. Just such a man as she could wish her father to be. And then Lena felt glad that the youth had asked her nothing concerning her parentage, for though her grandmother had seldom mentioned her father in her presence, there were others ready and willing to inform her that he was a villain who broke her mother's heart. When they reached Albany, the boy rose, and offering his hand to Lena, said, I suppose I must bid you goodbye, but I'd like right well to go farther with you. At this moment the stranger gentleman came up, and on seeing how his son was occupied, said smilingly, So ho, Durwood, you always manage to make some lady acquaintance. Yes, father, returned the boy called Durwood, but not always one like this. Isn't she pretty? He added in a whisper. The stranger's eyes fell on Lena's face, and for a moment, as if by some strange fascination, seemed riveted there. But the crowd pressed him forward, and Lena only heard him reply to his son, Yes, Durwood, very pretty, but hurry, or we shall lose the boat. The next moment they were gone. Leaning from the window, Lena tried to catch another glimpse of him, but in vain. He was gone. She would never see him again, she thought, and then she fell into a reverie concerning his home, his mother, his sisters, if he had any, and finally ended by wishing that she were his sister, and the daughter of his father. While she was thus pondering, her grandmother also was busy, and when Lena looked around for her, she was gone. Stepping from the car, Lena espied her in the distance, standing by her uncle and anxiously watching for the appearance of her great trunk, little trunk, bandbox, and bag. Each of these articles was forthcoming, and in a few moments they were on the ferry boat crossing the blue waters of the Hudson. Mrs. Nichols declaring that, if she'd known it wasn't a bridge she was stepping onto, she'd be bound they wouldn't have got her on it in one while. Do sit down, said Lena. The other people don't seem to be afraid, and I'm sure we needn't. This Mrs. Nichols was more willing to do, as directly at her side was another old lady, travelling for the first time, frightened and anxious. To her Mrs. Nichols addressed herself, announcing her firm belief that she would be blue sky-high before she reached Kentucky, where she was going to live with her son John, who she supposed was well off. Here a little popcorn boy came around, which reminded Mrs. Nichols of her money, and that she hadn't once looked after it since she started. Thinking this as favourable a time as she would have, she drew from her capacious pocket an old knit purse, and commenced counting out its contents piece by piece. Beware of pickpockets, said someone in her ear, and with the exclamation of, Oh, the Lord, the purse disappeared in her pocket, on which she kept her hand until the boat touched the opposite shore. Then, in the confusion and excitement, it was withdrawn, the purse was forgotten, and when on board the night express for Buffalo, it was again looked for, it was gone. With a wild outcry, the horror-stricken matron sprang up, calling for John, who in some alarm came to her side, asking what she wanted. I've lost my purse. Somebody stole it. Lock the door quick and search every man, woman, and child in the car. The conductor, who chanced to be present, now came up, demanding an explanation and trying to convince Mrs. Nichols how improbable it was that anyone present had her money. Stop the train then and let me get off. Had you a large amount? Asked the conductor. Every cent I had in the world. Ain't you going to let me off? Was the answer. The conductor looked inquiringly at John, who shook his head at the same time, whispering to his mother not to feel so badly, as he would give her all the money she wanted. Then, placing a $10 bill in her hand, he took a seat behind her. We doubt whether this would have quieted the old lady, had not a happy idea that moment entered her mind, causing her to exclaim loudly, "Then now, I've just this minute thought. I hadn't but $5 in my purse. T'other 50 I sold up in an old nightgown sleeve and tucked it away in that satchel up there," pointing to Lena's travel bag, which hung over her head. She would undoubtedly have designated the very corner of said satchel in which her money could be found had not her son touched her shoulder, bidding her be silent and not tell everybody where her money was, if she didn't want it stolen. Mrs. Nichols made no reply, but when she thought she was not observed, she arose, and slightly taking down the satchel, placed it under her. Then seating herself upon it, she gave a sigh of relief as she thought, they'd have to work hard to get it now without her knowing it. Dear old soul, when arriving at her journey's end, how much comfort she took in recounting over and over again the incidents of the robbery, wondering if it was, as John said, the very man who had so kindly cautioned her to beware of pickpockets, and who thus ascertained where she kept her purse. Nancy Scovendike, too, was duly informed of her loss, and charged when she came to Kentucky. So look out on the ferry boat for a youngish, good-looking man with a brown frock coat, blue cravat, and mouth full of white teeth. At Buffalo, Mr. Livingston had hard work to coax his mother on board the steamboat, but he finally succeeded, and as the weather chanced to be fine, she declared the ride on the lake to be the pleasantest part of her journey. At Cleveland, they took the cars for Cincinnati, going thence to Lexington by stage. On ordinary occasions, Mrs. Livingston would have preferred the river, but knowing that in all probability she would meet with some of his friends upon the boat, he chose the route via Lexington, where he stopped at the Phoenix, as was his usual custom. After seeing his mother and niece into the public parlor, he left them for a time, saying he had some business to transact in the city. Scarcely was he gone when the sound of shuffling footsteps in the hall announced an arrival, and a moment after, a boy, apparently 15 years of age, appeared in the door. He was richly, though carelessly dressed, and notwithstanding the good-humoured expression of his rather handsome face, there was in his whole appearance an indescribable something which at once pronounced him to be a fast boy. A rowdy hat was set on one side of his head, after the most approved fashion, while in his hand he held a lighted cigar, which he applied to his mouth when he saw the parlour was unoccupied, save by an old woman and a little girl. Instinctively Lena shrank from him, and withdrawing herself as far as possible within the recesses of the window, pretended to be busily watching the passers-by. But she did not escape his notice, and after coolly surveying her for a moment, he walked up to her, saying, "How do you do, Pollywog? I'd be hanged if I don't get to know what gender you belong, woman or gal. Which is it, eh?" "None of your business," was Lena's ready answer. "Spunky, ain't you?" said he unceremoniously, pulling out one of the brown curls which Durward had so longed to touch. "Seems to me your hair don't match the rest of you. Wonder if it isn't someone else's head set on your shoulders." "No, it ain't. It's my own head, and you just let it alone," returned Lena, growing more and more indignant, and wondering if this was a specimen of Kentucky boys. "Don't be saucy," continued her tormentor. "I only want to see what sort of stuff you are made of." "Made of dirt," muttered Lena. "I reckon you are," returned the boy. "But say, where did you come from, and who do you live with?" "I'm from Massachusetts, and I live with Granny," said Lena, thinking that if she answered him civilly, he would perhaps let her alone. But she was mistaken. Glancing at Granny, he burst into a loud laugh, and then placing his hat a little more on one side, and assuming a nasal twang, said, "Now do tell me, if you're from Massachusetts, how do you do, little Yankee, and how are all folks to hum?" Feeling sure that not only herself but all her relations were included in this insult, Lena darted forward, hitting him a blow in the face, which returned by puffing smoke into hers. whereupon she snatched the cigar from his mouth and hurled it into the street, bidding him touch her again if he dared. All this transpired so rapidly that Mrs. Nichols had hardly time to understand its meaning, but fully comprehending it now, she was about to coming to the rescue when her son reappeared, exclaiming, John Livingston Jr., how came you here?" Had a cannon exploded at the feet of John Jr., as he was called, he could not have been more startled. He was not expecting his father for 2 or 3 days, and was making the most of his absence by having what he called a regular spree. Taking him altogether, he was, without being naturally bad, a spoiled child, whom no one could manage except his father, and his father seldom tried. He was, of course, seldom managed. Yet never had he remained at any school for more than 2 quarters, for if he were not sent away, he generally ran away, sure of finding a champion in his mother, who had always petted him, calling him Johnny Darling, until one day, very coolly, he informed her that she was a silly old fool, and that he'd thank her not to Johnny Darling him any longer. It would be difficult to describe the amazement of John Jr. when Lena was presented to him as his cousin, and Mrs. Nichols as his grandmother. Something which sounded very much like an oath escaped his lips, as turning to his father he muttered, "Won't mother go into fits?" Then, as he began to realize the ludicrousness of the whole affair, he exclaimed, "Rich, goodbye gracious," and laughing loudly, he walked away to regale himself with another cigar. Lena began to tremble for her future happiness, if this boy was to live in the same house with her. She did not know that she had already more than half won his good opinion, for he was far better pleased with her antagonistical demonstrations than he would have been had she cried or ran from him, as his sister Anna generally did when he teased her. After a few moments, he turned to the parlour, and walking up to Mrs. Nichols, commenced talking very sociably with her, calling her Granny and winking slyly at Lena as he did so. Mr. Livingston had too much good sense to sit quietly by and hear his mother ridiculed by his son, and in a loud, stern voice he bade the young gentleman behave himself. "Oh, now," said Mrs. Nichols, "let him talk if he wants to. I like to hear him. He's the only grandson I've got." This speech had the effect of silencing John Jr. quite as much as his father's command. If he could tease his grandmother by talking to her, he would take little delight in doing so. But if she wanted him to talk, that was quite another thing. So moving away from her, he took a seat near Lena, telling her her dress was a heap too short, and occasionally pinching her just to vary the sport. This last, however, Lena returned with so much force that he grew weary of the fun, and informing her that he was going to the circus which was in town that evening, he arose to leave the room. Mr. Livingston, who partially overheard what he had said, stopped him and asked him where he was going. Feigning a yawn and rubbing his eyes, John Jr. replied that he was confounded sleepy and was going to bed. "Lena, where did he say he was going?" asked her uncle. Lena trembled, for John Jr. had clenched his fist and was shaking it threateningly at her. "Where did he say he was going?" repeated her uncle. Poor Lena had never told a lie in her life, and now braving her cousin's anger, she said, "To the circus, sir. I wish he had not asked me." "You'll get your pay for that," muttered John Jr., suddenly reseating himself by his father, who kept an eye on him until he saw him safely in his room. Much as John Jr. frightened Lena with his threats, in his heart he respected her for telling the truth. And if the next morning on their way home in the stage, in which his father compelled him to take a seat, he frequently found it convenient to step on her feet, it was more from a natural propensity to torment than from any lurking feeling of revenge. Lena was nowise backward in returning his cousinly attentions, and so between the interchange of kicks, wry faces, and so forth, they proceeded towards Maple Grove, a description of which will be given in another chapter. Chapter 4. Maple Grove. The residence of Mr. Livingston, or rather of Mr. Livingston's wife, was a large, handsome building such as one often finds in Kentucky, particularly in the country. Like most planters' houses, it stood at some little distance from the street, from which its massive walls, wreathed with evergreen, were just discernible. The carriage road which led to it passed first through a heavy iron gate, guarded by huge bronze lions, so natural and lifelike that Mrs. Nichols, when she first saw them, uttered a cry of fear. Next came a beautiful maple grove, followed by a long green lawn, dotted here and there with forest trees, and having on its right a deep running brook, whose waters further on at the rear of the garden were formed into a miniature fish pond. The house itself was of brick, two-storied and surrounded on three sides with a double piazza, whose pillars were entwined with climbing roses, honeysuckle, and running vines, so closely interwoven as to give it the appearance of an immense summer house. In the spacious yard in front, tall shade trees and bright green grass were growing, while in the well-kept garden at the left bloomed an endless variety of roses and flowering shrubs, which in their season filled with perfume and made the spot brilliant with beauty. Directly through the centre of this garden ran the stream of which we have spoken, and as its mossy banks were never disturbed, they presented the appearance of a soft velvety ridge, where each spring the starry dandelion and the blue-eyed violet grew. Across the brook 2 small footbridges had been built, both of which were latticed and overgrown by luxuriant grapevines, whose dark green foliage was now intermingled with clusters of the rich purple fruit. At the right, and somewhat in the rear of the building, was a group of linden trees, overshadowed by the whitewashed houses of the staff who, imitating as far as possible the taste of their master, beautified their dwellings with hop vines, creepers, hollyhocks, and the like. Although it was, as Lena said, just the kind of place which one reads of in stories, and which is often found at the sunny south, the interior of the building corresponded with the exterior, for with one exception, the residence of a wealthy Englishman, Mrs. Livingston prided herself upon having the best furnished house in the county. Consequently, neither pains nor money had been spared in the selection of the furniture, which was of the most costly kind. Carrie, the eldest of the daughters, was now 13 years of age. Proud, imperious, deceitful, and self-willed, she was hated by the servants and disliked by her equals. Some thought her pretty. She felt sure of it, and many an hour she spent before the mirror, admiring herself and anticipating the time when she would be a grown-up lady, and as a matter of course, a belle. Her mother, unfortunately, belonged to that class which seemed to think that the chief aim in life is to secure a brilliant match, and thinking she could not commence too soon, she had early instilled in her favourite daughter's mind the necessity of appearing to the best possible advantage when in the presence of wealth and distinction, pointing out that her own marriage is a proof of the unhappiness resulting from unequal matches. In this way, Carrie had early learned that her father owed his present position to her mother's condescension in marrying him, that he was once a poor boy living among the northern hills, that his parents were poor, ignorant, and vulgar, and there was with them a little girl, their daughter's child, who never had a father, and whom she must never on any occasion call her cousin. All this had likewise been told to Anna, the youngest daughter, who was about Lena's age, but upon her it made no impression. If her father was once poor, he was, in her opinion, none the worse for that, and if he liked his parents, that was sufficient reason why she should like them too. And if little Lena was an orphan, she pitied her, and hoped she might sometime see her and tell her so. Thus Anna reasoned, while her mother, terribly shocked at her low-bred taste, strove to instill into her mind some of her own more aristocratic notions. But all in vain, for Anna was purely democratic, loving everybody and beloved by everyone in turn. It was true she had no particular liking for books or study of any kind, but she was gentle and affectionate in her manner and kindly considerate of others' feelings. With her father she was a favourite, and to her he always looked for sympathy, which she seldom failed to give. Not in words, it is true, but whenever he seemed to be in trouble, she would climb into his lap, wind her arms around his neck, and laying her golden head upon his shoulder, would sit thus until his brow and heart grew lighter, as he felt there was something yet in the wide world which loved and cared for him. For Carrie, Mrs. Livingston had great expectations, but Anna, she feared, would never make a brilliant match. For a long time, Anna meditated upon this, wondering what a brilliant match could mean, and at last she determined to seek an explanation from Captain Atherton, a bachelor and a millionaire who was in the habit of visiting them, and who always noticed and petted her more than he did Carrie. Accordingly, the next time he came and they were alone in the parlour, she broached the subject, asking him what it meant. Laughing loudly, the captain drew her towards him, saying, "Why, marrying rich, you little novice? For instance, if one of these days you should be my little wife, I dare say your mother would think you had made a brilliant match." And the well-preserved gentleman of 40 glanced complacently at himself in the mirror, thinking how probable it was that his usefulness would be unimpaired for at least 10 years to come. Anna laughed, for to her his words then conveyed no serious meaning, but with more than her usual quickness she replied that she would as soon marry her grandfather. With Mrs. Livingston the reader is partially acquainted. In her youth she had been pretty, and now at 38 she was not without pretensions to beauty, notwithstanding her sallow complexion and sunken eyes. Her hair, which was very abundant, was bright and glossy, and her mouth, in which the dentist had done his best, would have been handsome had it not have been for a certain draw at the corners, which gave it a scornful and rather disagreeable expression. In her disposition she was overbearing and tyrannical, fond of ruling, and deeming her husband a monster of ingratitude if ever in any way he manifested a spirit of rebellion. Didn't she marry him? And now they were married, didn't her money support him? And wasn't it exceedingly amiable in her always to speak of their children as ours? But as for the house, 'twas my house, my servants, my carriage, my horses, all mine. Mrs. John Livingston's, Miss Matilda Richards, that was. Occasionally, however, her husband's spirit was roused, and then, after a series of tears, sick headaches, and then spasms, Miss Matilda Richards that was compelled to yield her face for many days, wearing the look of a much-injured, broken-hearted woman. Still, her influence over him was great, else she had never so effectively weakened every tie which bound him to his native home, making him ashamed of his parents and of everything pertaining to them. When her husband first wrote to her that his father was dead, and he had promised to take charge of his mother and Lena, she flew into a violent rage, which was increased tenfold when she received his second letter, wherein he announced his intention of bringing them home in spite of her. Bursting into tears, she declared she'd leave the house before she'd have it filled up with a lot of paupers. Who did John Nichols think he was, and who did he think she was? Besides that, where was he going to put them, for there wasn't a place for them that she knew of. "Why, mother," said Anna, who was pleased with the prospect of a new grandmother and cousin. "Why, mother, what a story. There's the 2 big chambers and bedrooms, besides the one next to Carrie's and mine. Oh, to put them in there. It'd be so nice to have Grandma and Cousin Lena so near me." "Anna Livingston," returned the indignant lady, "never let me hear you say Grandma and Cousin again." "But there be Grandma and Cousin," persisted Anna, while her mother commenced lamenting the circumstance which made them so, wishing, as she had often done before, that she had never married John Nichols. "I reckon you're not the only one that wishes so," slyly whispered John Jr., who was a witness to her emotion. Anna was naturally of an inquiring mind, and her mother's last remark awoke within her a new and strange train of thought, causing her to wonder whose little girl she would have been, her father's or mother's, in case they had each married someone else. And there was no one else whose opinion Anna dared ask. The question is undoubtedly to this day, with her, unsolved. The next morning, when Mrs. Livingston arose, her anger of the day before was somewhat abated, and knowing from past experience that it was useless to resist her husband when once he was determined, she wisely concluded that as they were now probably on the road, it was best to try and endure, for a time at least, what could not well be helped. And now arose the perplexing question, what should she do with them? Where should she put them in any way that would be the most out of the way? For she could never suffer to have them round when she had company. The chamber of which Anna had spoken was out of the question, for it was too nice, and besides that, it was reserved for the children of her New Orleans friends, who nearly every summer came up to visit her. At the rear of the building was a long, low room containing a fireplace and 2 windows, which looked out on the slave quarters and the hemp fields beyond. The room, which in the summer was used for storing feather beds, blankets, and so forth, was plastered, but minus either paper or paint. Still, it was quite comfortable. Better than they were accustomed to at home, Mrs. Livingston said, and this she decided to give them. Accordingly, the slaves were set at work scrubbing the floor, washing the windows, and scouring the sills until the room at least possessed the virtue of being clean. A faded carpet, discarded as good for nothing, and over which the rats had long held their nightly revels, was brought into light, shaken, mended, and nailed down. Then came a bedstead, which Mrs. Livingston had designed as a Christmas gift to one of the slaves, but which of course would do well enough for her mother-in-law. Next followed an old wooden rocking chair, whose ancestry Anna had tried in vain to trace, and which Carrie had often proposed burning. This, with 2 or 3 more chairs of a later date, a small wardrobe, and a square table, completed the furniture of the room, if we except the plain muslin curtains which shaded the windows, destitute of blinds. Taking it by itself, the room looked tolerably well, but when compared with the richly furnished apartments around it, it seemed meagre and poor indeed. But if they wanted anything else, they could get it themselves. They were welcome to make any alterations they chose. This mode of reasoning hardly satisfied Anna, and unknown to her mother, she took from her own chamber a handsome hearth rug, and carrying it to her grandmother's room, laid it before the fireplace. Coming accidentally upon a roll of green paper, she, with the help of Corinda, a black girl, made some shades for the windows which faced the west, rendering the room intolerably hot during the summer seasons. Then, at the suggestion of Corinda, she looped back the muslin curtains with some green ribbons, which she had intended using for her dolly's dress. The bare appearance of the table troubled her, but by rummaging she brought to light a cast-off spread, which though soiled and worn, was on one side quite handsome. "Now if only we had something for the mantel," said she. "It seems so empty." Corinda thought a moment, then rolling up the whites of her eyes, replied, "Don't you mind them little pictures, meaning vases, which Master Athen done give you? They look mighty fine up there, full of sprigs and posies." Without hesitating a moment, Anna brought the vases, and as she did not know the exact time when her grandmother would arrive, she determined to fill them with fresh flowers every morning. And I think I will call it there for tonight. As usual, if you would like to pick up where I left off and carry on with the rest of the story, you can find it on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepytime Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes are released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.